Welcome, dear friends and colleagues. Welcome to 16th Belgrade International Architecture Week. I would like to say hello to all of you who are not only in Belgrade, in our schools of architecture or schools where history of architecture has been taught in this city. I would like to welcome and say hello to all of our students who are at the moment in Iowa, in Boston, in Scotland, and around the globe. This year, our manifestation, our event, is focusing on housing, one of the most important topics in Eastern Europe. If we consider Serbia and Belgrade Eastern Europe in the period after World War II, and we want through this event to promote the values of so-called Belgrade School of Housing, as opposed to contemporary trends in housing, which pretty much irritate all of us who studied at that time. So the idea is that today we position that Belgrade School of Housing within some broader international context, and that's why we invited speakers from abroad to give their insight. In the studio in Belgrade, it's me, Tanja Konli, who's been teaching architecture history at Mass Art Boston, and my colleague and friend, Vladimir Lojanica, who teaches studio and the problems of housing here at Belgrade Faculty of Architecture.
It's a pleasure to be a part of this conference today, and of course I can just say that the BINA is gaining more and more popularity these days, more than ever before, I guess. This is definitely due to the enormous efforts that people organizing BINA are doing, in terms of making this manifestation widely spread. And the second thing that I think that's in focus now is that actually the topic of this year's BINA, which is very interested not only to the professionals, but also to the general public, since we are speaking about the residential architecture. So without further ado, I would really like to thank you to Mr. Florian Urban for joining us today and in this conference. So Florian Urban is a professor of architectural history and head of history of architectural and urban studies at Glasgow School of Art. He was born and raised in Munich, Germany, and holds a Master of Fine Arts from the University of the Arts in Berlin, and Master in Urban Planning from UCLA, and PhD in History and Theory of Architecture from MIT. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today, Florian.
As you can see, I'm here in beautiful Scotland, and weather that you only get once in a year. And in the background, you can see the Stirling Monument. So I'm in the city of Stirling. I got stuck in traffic, so I couldn't make it home. So, but nonetheless, I'm very, very happy to give this lecture, which has a lot to do with the research that I've been doing in the last few years. So I'm going to share my screen now to give a short introduction into the topic of mass housing. Can you see it? Yes. Okay. As Vladimir has already said, I'm originally from Munich, from Germany, and I spent actually the first 6 years of my life in a standardized tower block. And it strikes me that these buildings are perhaps the most widespread typology of all times. But at the same time, no architectural type in history has roused comparable controversies. And these differences gave rise to my research project, Tower and Slab, which was published as a book in 2012. I looked at mass housing in 6 different cities: Berlin, Paris, Chicago, Moscow, Brasilia, Mumbai, and Shanghai. And I looked at the different narratives that were connected to mass housing in these different contexts. So in the book, I define mass housing not by size, not by technology, and not by design, but by two ideological principles. And one was the principle of equal living standards, equality, and the other one of the belief in the state as a facilitator for these principles, state paternalism. These principles developed against the appalling conditions of the early industrial era. And I just want to point out that the original goals were not at a fulfilling everyday life or at producing a creative community or at democratic participation, but exclusively as providing light, air, water, and privacy. And with regard to these original goals, mass housing has been entirely successful almost everywhere in the world, not only in the much celebrated Siedlungen in Germany of the 1920s, but also in a lot of the buildings that later roused considerably more controversy. In the bulk of mass housing was built in the era after the Second World War. In 1955, Nikita Khrushchev started his famous industrialization program, which was then imitated in most of Eastern Europe, but it was paralleled also by the social democratic visions in Western Europe. And this developed again against appalling conditions of the time. The average city dweller in the Soviet Union in the 1950s had 7 square meters dwelling space per person. That is about a little more than a king-size bed, possibly 2 king-size beds, I would say. So in the early 1960s, architects began to design what corresponds to the popular image of mass housing, these centrally planned neighborhoods according to the principles of modernist urban planning, functional separation, primacy of car traffic, etc. They were more standardized in Eastern Europe, but otherwise comparable in other countries as well. It developed against the background of the belief in progress and development, in scientifically founded expert solution. But the important point is that in the following, mass housing fared very differently, and the perceived success or the perceived failure often changed very abruptly. In some cases, it was a matter of only a few months. For example, the Märkisches Viertel in West Berlin stood first for progress and modernization, collective advancement, and for improved living standards. And then it came to mean the oppressive force of modernism, such as top-down planning, disenfranchisement of the individual, and the neglect of tradition. So I'm not going to get deeper what actually provoked this in this case, but just would like to point that this was paralleled in many other countries as well. In Glasgow, where I teach now, there was a similar development. The unloved council housing estate Red Road Flats was only demolished a few years ago. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the perceived success of a development such as this one. Mind the quotation marks of successful, because obviously it is according to what success means. And the success is rarely measured by the original goals, because the presence of running water, central heating, and the absence of overcrowding are no longer perceived as success. But here we see an example for a cultural context in which modernist mass housing has never been demonized. There was no Pruit-Igoe in Spain, no Sarcelles, no Bielmamere, no Vellingy, and modernist housing is well liked by all classes, including the wealthy middle classes. So this development was built in the 1980s, and this is mostly a middle class development. So it was developed well after the big wave of bad reviews, and it repeats all the difficulties of modernist housing. Functionalist design, more or less, large development, etc., etc. It is still positively viewed. So these are plain functionalist buildings with spacious plans, and have the development has about 30,000 inhabitants, almost 10% of the population of Valladolid. Nonetheless, no bad image. But there are also similarly, quote unquote, successful estates in Eastern Europe. So this one in Poland, Sady Żoliborskie, has all the advantages and disadvantages of a modernist development. It is quite and full of light and greenery, but it is separated from the city center by large roads. So the probably most important why this is still positively viewed are citywide factors. First, Sady Żoliborskie is located in a central, well-reputed neighborhood. And second, there is next to no alternative to modernist housing in Warsaw. As the city was comprehensively destroyed in the Second World War, there is still an extreme housing shortage. So even though these flats are small by today's standards, hardly anyone can afford to move out. So I could go on with context of successful mass housing, particularly if one looks beyond Europe. There are many contexts in which the very affluent live in functionalist blocks, as here in Cuff Parade or in Brilliant City. But my point is that it depended on particular cultural contexts and particular historical developments, whether or not mass housing was demonized. You can even also see differences in Europe. In some cases, the demonization caught on less than in others. Both of these examples, for example, are much criticized for their small flats, for their cheap construction quality, but they're anything but ghettos. Most inhabitants don't belong to marginalized groups, and the inhabitants praise the central location and the access to services and public transport. So, what does then decide over perceived success and failure? So the bad news for architects is that the most important factors are beyond the activity of the architect. It's not good versus bad design that had most influence on perceived success or failure. I would say possibly the most important factor is the urban context, whether central or peripheral, whether easy to reach, whether a desired or undesired neighborhood. Second, there are the alternatives, the availability of different forms of housing. In cities where almost all inhabitants live in some form of mass housing, as in Warsaw, there is no discussion. And this is also connected with the social status of the inhabitants, whether this is a poor neighborhood or a mixed or a wealthy neighborhood. And these things can obviously change. And they have much to do with housing policies, both at a municipal level or at a national level, but they have little to do with the actual design of these buildings. But I don't want to go as far as to say that the design has no influence. I think architectural design is still influential once these other three aspects are taken care of. It appears to make a huge difference if mass housing is well designed. So thank you very much. I'll leave it here, and I am looking forward to your discussion with that.
Thank you very much, Florian. This was awesome. Thanks. The idea is to have all our three guests first with their presentations, and then we will save the questions for later on for the open discussion. Thanks again, and I'll let Tanja now announce our next speaker.
So our next speaker is Professor Kimberli Zarekor, who teaches architecture in the College of Design at Iowa State University. Mainly, she teaches architecture history and design since 2005. She holds her PhD in architecture from Columbia University, and her historical research examines the cultural and technological history of architecture and urbanism in the former Czechoslovakia. Kimberli, let us hear your understanding and presentation on this topic.
Great. So hello, hopefully everyone can hear me. And I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it's working. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to speak to all of you across the ocean on a nice Saturday, beautiful spring Saturday. So Tanya and the organizers asked me to talk about the experience of mass housing in Czechoslovakia, which is where I know the most. So I decided to stick with what I know, in the sense that I'm going to talk in particular terms about Czechoslovakia, but a lot of what I have to say really fits nicely with what Florian just presented. And in fact, some of my slides are the same places as Florian showed, which is an interesting overlap that you will see. Oops. So I wanted to start by talking about my research, and I wrote this book back in 2011 that was based on my dissertation and then was translated into Czech. And the research question driving my research was specific to Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia had this reputation in the interwar period in being a very special place. And so the question that I asked was, given the strong presence and high quality of avant-garde architecture and design in Czechoslovakia before 1945, how, when, and why did prefabrication and standardized construction emerge as the dominant method for building construction? And Tanya, when I was reading your catalog text that goes with the Bina exhibition, I noticed that you made a comment in particular about Czechoslovakia, and commenting essentially that the housing was better in the interwar period and was not so good after the war. And I guess my whole presentation, not because you made that comment, but my whole presentation is essentially a reflection on that, because that's what drove my dissertation research, was to ask that question. But my answer that I come to is different than the implication of your comments, because I think that the housing in Czechoslovakia was, in particular there, a fulfillment of a modernist conception of what mass housing could be, that was really a kind of fantasy fulfillment based on the vision of the interwar period. Fantasy in the sense that no one ever believed it would ever be possible to build at the scale and for the number of people that the radical left in Czechoslovakia thought about in the interwar period. And Czechoslovakia had a legal communist party starting in 1921, another uniqueness about the country. And its Marxist architects were very dedicated to the question of housing very early. And so I like to think about the continuity in the vision of housing from the interwar period into the post-war period, rather than a kind of break. And anyone who knows about my research knows this is one of my major themes. Oops. So I like to start with just this sort of index slide. And I was impressed, Tanya, with the format of your exhibition, which is similar in some ways to the way that I like to think about this, that there are evolutions over decades, and that we can think about these different moments in time with housing as having particular characteristics, and that they evolve. So there's not the monolith of mass housing. It's not one thing. So for these kinds of housing endeavors, my thought about this, and this goes with what Florian was speaking about, there's an emphasis here on the collective good, of providing the minimum and then above the minimum quality of life for everyone, and that industrial production is necessary to scale up the number of units. So when I'm thinking about, what are the goals? Florian was talking about measures of success. I would also say that this is an interesting question: what makes a successful housing product or development? And this is how I think about the goals. The goals are not set up the same way in a capitalist context than they are in the socialist context. And for me, this is one of the key things to understand about the comparisons between socialist and capitalist housing. Has more to do with what the goal is of the housing than the way that the housing looks. So in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s, you can see on the left, this is one of the very first social housing developments designed by architects who later would become part of, they would build famous things after the war, particularly Hilsky. And Yech also was somebody who was very involved with prefabrication. They won a municipal housing competition in the 30s. They built these apartments that are basically minimum dwellings following the Siam model. After the war, Czechoslovakia has a communist government. The first mass housing production primarily is in a socialist realist style. And I write a lot about this in my book if you're interested in that particular moment. By the 1960s, the housing is more in the model of international style, high modernism, tower blocks interspersed with medium density. And I like this picture in particular. It shows a kind of beautiful aesthetic of these tall towers. Then by the 1970s, you have an increase in the number and the density of units, and you have this transformation in the construction processes to crane urbanism, to a kind of mass production in which the quality of the facade, the differences in the components of the building facade are less differentiated. So they become less beautiful, but the scale is just impressive. So I am with Florian that, you know, the actual production of housing here is always underestimated in terms of its effect on the population and then the number of people who get to live in modern housing. Okay, so I want to just start by saying that in Czechoslovakia, it's a very industrialized economy already in the interwar period. And this prowess with industrial production comes into play after the war because Czechoslovakia is one of the first countries in the world that successfully moves to fully prefabricated housing construction. So on the left side, you can see a diagram from a textbook that I found in the National Library in Prague, showing the 4 stages of construction, starting with massive block construction, working with prefabricated skeleton pieces. And finally, the most prized kind of construction was when there's no structural skeleton. So the reinforcing steel that holds the building together is embedded in the panels, and then the panels themselves are structural. So it's a system that leaves little flexibility because you have just these wall panels for the floors, ceilings, and facades, and partitions in these early buildings. And the cover of my book is here on the right side. This is one of the first developments of fully prefabricated panel block housing. These buildings, like I said, have no skeleton. Every panel is structural, and they look in some ways to our eye like a house of cards. You know, every piece is part of the construction. And the big gantry crane is critical to this technology. The scale shift happens a little later. This is the construction of Petržalka, which is now in Slovakia in the 1980s. And this development shows how the height of the buildings increased, how the density of the buildings increased. The buildings themselves are very large. And this is crane urbanism, in which the buildings end up constructed sort of in a line based on the path of the crane. And so the development scales up from feeling as if each building is part of an urban ensemble, and it scales up into more of a networked model in which the entire development is made up of a series of lines and nodes. And you start to see the influence, I think, also of Team 10 and different things that happen in the 1960s, in which not only communist architects, but also capitalist architects are interested in this shifting scale to something bigger. I just want us to, key this to what was happening in the 30s. I already started to say this, but Karl Teige, the famous Czech critic, wrote this amazing book called Nejmenší byt, The Minimum Dwelling, in 1932, which about 20 years ago is fully translated into English. So if anyone's interested in reading this book, it exists in English. And it's an amazing text on the housing crisis in Europe. I think it's underappreciated, the depth of detail and the argument that Teige makes, which is that the housing crisis cannot be overcome through the real estate market. And I think this now is an argument that people understand, but he puts it in extremely detailed and kind of stark terms to say you're never going to solve this problem if you leave it to the capitalists, essentially. He also is part of a group that gets the housing question text translated to Czech, which is from the 1870s, and here is the 1932 edition of that book. And then also one of his collaborators publishes a book in 1946 that has on the cover an image of what becomes known as the living core. And this is all of the things you need for life: cooking, so the kitchen, bathing, the bathtub, and then the toilet and the shower. It's all in a box that goes in the center of the unit. And then the housing is kind of, the living spaces are arranged around it. You can see the living core, as it's called, in the center of this drawing on the cover of the book. And this is a critical innovation to understand that every unit needs one of these boxes, which holds the things that you need to live. And then the mass housing becomes a series of these boxes with varying scales of living spaces around them. So a bigger apartment still only needs one living core, if that makes sense, just has extra bedrooms, basically. So why did Czech and Slovak architects build paneláks? So they were looking for a solution for the housing shortages, especially in areas with new industries. They needed cheap, efficient, and fast construction. They wanted to extend the construction season through the winter, and prefabrication was important. The standardization and typification of design types worked well in a planned economy, so the 5-year plan could plan for the amount of building materials that you needed. And to Florian's point, ideologically, these standardized units followed an ethos that all people would have equal access to housing. So an engineer might live next to a teacher or a tram driver or a coal miner, and this was part of the thinking about the housing. These paneláks offered a minimum standard quality of life to the largest number of people at the lowest cost. So in that's one measure of success, as Florian was saying. In the Czech Republic, there's currently 80,000 paneláks, panel buildings, that have over 1 million apartments. And overall, about 30% of the Czech population lives still in a panelák. So this, the amount of housing, the success of housing people in these modern buildings is a huge legacy of the communist years. So I know I'm talking too long, so I'm going to run through the remainder of my slides a little bit more quickly. I want to frame this goes to Florian's presentation too. I want to frame the question of success and also aspiration in an American context as well. So as an American coming to the topic of mass housing, it was hard for me to wrap my mind around the aspiration to live in a prefabricated panel building, because I had been culturally indoctrinated as an American to believe that the single family house is the greatest sign of success, and that is the standard for a good quality of life. And I think it's helpful for students in particular to think about how they now frame for themselves what a quality living environment looks like. And the single family house has kind of traveled around the world as a model, but for ecological reasons, for climate crisis reasons, for questions of mass public transportation, we are seeing, I think, a return to a more dense model. But starting in the 1950s, this view of Levittown, for example, the famous American, these houses, in fact, are prefabricated. They're a mass production themselves, but each house is on its own individual piece of land. What I like to say is that this vision in a capitalist 1950s United States is really the same as this vision of early communist housing in Czechoslovakia. It's the same aspiration to offer young families, young professionals, good quality modern housing and a good quality of life with services nearby. Schools, places to shop, a health clinic, places for recreation. This is called Bielski Les. For a while it was called Stalingrad, this neighborhood. And it had all of these components in it right at the same time that Levittown is being built. What happens over time is a scale shift. So that first 1950s vision of the 5-story high small blocks that are arranged around a green space, that have a nice sort of central space for all the services, this transforms by the 1970s and 80s into very large scale construction. And so this matches more with what Florian was showing in the other parts of the world. And for me, it's important to understand that the aspirations and the vision of socialist housing, it changed over time. So we can I think we see the 1950s vision has really high quality to it, and it gets a bit out of control when there's not maintenance, there's not good public spaces later in the construction periods. This picture I'm showing you is from right now, and they've completely redone the public spaces and all the buildings have been refurbished. So it looks a lot better. And that's another part of the story. So for example, these visions of children living in mass housing, we have on the left the Americans living in their little prefabricated boxes, and we have the Czechs on the right living in their prefabricated towers. And it's important for me, for everyone to think about the fact that the goals in some sense were the same, which was to offer a new vision for modern living that was together with the modernizing program of the government. And I think it helps us to kind of see similarities and differences. So as Florian said, this is an international movement to build the towers, to build more mass dense housing. We can see here what was the Soviet Union in Tallinn, Estonia, Mustamäe, Balta Aba, and Bucharest. But I also have here Valenby, which Florian talked about, and the French suburbs, the banlieue. And what I wanted to say about this is that the form of the housing in these cases does not match with other aspects of the aspirations. Some of these districts, like the French banlieue, were a process of social segregation of populations that were less desirable, that were sent out to the edges. And of course, this is not the initial goal, but it is how it happened, that these became more segregated, they became more distinct, and there's a stigmatization of the population. Valenby in Sweden is not like that, but it also was always built with better amenities and more bigger and nicer apartments. We also can look at Hong Kong and say there is a place in the world, and Singapore is similar, that has a lot of publicly funded mass housing. And it works for the reasons that Florian talked about. It's also the cultural expectation that a high rise is a form of luxury in this context, rather than a sign of something that's a stigma. So very quickly, just some beautiful examples of Czech housing. Here is Pankratz from the 1960s. This is the early high modernism. Nova Dvorska has beautiful art and water sort of interspersed with the buildings, which have these towers and also these longer buildings and lower buildings. And it's a beautiful ensemble in this neighborhood. Kirch that I showed you before, these very pointed towers that have, you can see space on the roof. They look very much like high-end luxury living, but over time the quality degrades because there's very little maintenance that happens. Ostrava Poruba, this is another version in a more provincial city from around 1970, where you see taller buildings but not towers. This is South City more recently. It has a shopping street embedded in here. And again, it's a community-oriented design so that the buildings become part of a lifestyle. Each building's not on its own, but they're now has been re-inhabited with modern shops, and you can get a latte and you can buy fancy stuff in these little shops. It's a really interesting evolution of this place. Here's Petržalka, the crane urbanism city that is about 1/3 of all of the residents in Bratislava live in Petržalka, across from the historic city center. And this is where, for me, the drive to go tall, the drive for mass standardization leaves the buildings with less architectural quality on their own. And this is what Petržalka looks like now. I've written a little bit about all these colors. The grayness has transformed into something that looks more like a rainbow. And there is also the integration now of high-end shopping and sort of luxury amenities that now makes this neighborhood very desirable. I think New Belgrade is probably having a similar situation happening, which is that what were public spaces, public amenities, things for the common good have been privatized and turned into nodes of capitalism. And it's very easy because the housing is a kind of floating piece within that environment that itself is now privatized. And so these can hook into that housing network very easily. So I will stop there. And look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. We are going to continue our debate about Czechoslovakia and Belgrade School of Housing. and trying to put everything in some broader context. But before that, we are going to introduce.
Yeah, okay. Okay. It's again, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next guest speaker. This is Vladimir Coolidge. He has his PhD in architecture. He's a historian, curator, and critics, and associate professor at the College of Design, Iowa State University. On this point, I would like to mention that also he, with his education, originated from the Faculty of Architecture, University of Belgrade. He's basically one of the most famous recent achievements was that he was a co-curator of the exhibition Towards the Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia between 1948 and 1980 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So Vlada, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tanya and Vladimir, in the introduction, for inviting me. It's a really pleasure to be home in a way, even if it's remotely. It's part of our Zoom life, I guess, these days. But let's hope that we actually get to see each other in person sometime soon. I responded to the prompt that came to me by trying to engage with this question of the Belgrade School of Housing or Belgrade School of Residential Architecture in response to the two kinds of audience that I imagine we have here today. A lot of local audience, including the hosts who are very knowledgeable about it. And then also our guests from elsewhere, for whom this might be sort of an unknown phenomenon. So I'm going to try to sort of address both of these audiences at the same time by trying to define what this Belgrade school meant, right? And at the same time, try to offer a different or perhaps a fresh a new view for those who are knowledgeable about it, and that might allow us to situate the significance of the Belgrade School in the wider context of modernist architecture. So I'm very, very grateful to Florian and Tanya, Kimberli, for their previous presentations, because they provide a great framework for me to plug my presentation into the wider global story of mass housing after World War II. So let me share my screen. Okay, Zoom is not showing me the button. Okay, yes. You can see my screen, I hope.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's then start with my presentation. What is this Belgrade School, right? It's obviously not a school, right? It's literally, institutionally, right? The Faculty of Architecture of the University of Belgrade was a part of it, but this Belgrade School that we talk about was something more than that. And I wanted to propose that maybe we should look at it as something that I'd like to call a design ecosystem, and a very decentralized design ecosystem that consisted of many different institutions and agents. I think Kimberli will have something to say in this respect, because she studied a lot the organization of the architectural profession in socialism, especially specifically in Czechoslovakia. And I'm bringing this up in order to highlight the possible differences in the wider social and economic mechanisms that produced this design ecosystem. What do I mean by this ecosystem? I would say it was a conglomerate, sort of an assemblage of various educational and research institutions. And please, this is what I'm showing on the screen are just examples of some of the most important of these actors. There were a lot more, so this is not an exhaustive catalog, right? From the Faculty of Architecture, Institute for Architecture and Urbanism, famously the Institute for Material Testing and its Housing Center, etc. So that's one layer. The next layer would be clients, a very specific network of clients, including self-managing communities, and very importantly, the Yugoslav People's Army, which also in some ways was a contributor to research and education, having its own research and design unit. The next layer would be design and construction companies, right? Various enterprises that implemented the results of research and the needs of clients into practice. Then we have the important role played by professional organizations, including the organizers of the Belgrade Architecture Week, right? The Association of Belgrade Architects, who facilitated the organization of the prime vehicle for how this knowledge that was created was disseminated in practice. And these were public competitions. The vast majority of large-scale important housing projects in Belgrade, but pretty much in most of Yugoslavia, were very commonly put to public competitions, which sort of opened the design to a variety of views. And these public competitions ultimately allowed the density of research, right, to be put into practice. And finally, last but not least, on the contrary, were the various individual architects who specialized in this type of architecture. And here's just the sample of the most famous people, whether kind of important figures like Mate Bajlon, who started the discussion of housing at the Faculty of Architecture already in the 50s, to practitioners, including Vladimir's own father, my professor Lojanica, who very interestingly floated in some ways between these different institutional frameworks. And very often they worked in teams where different members of the teams belonged to different institutions. So it was in many ways a complex and densely intertwined ecosystem where different parts of the system interacted to a great deal. This design ecosystem produced a vast amount of its own knowledge, which was widely disseminated and published. And I understand that this legendary issue of the journal Arhitectura Urbanism that you see on the right is being reissued now, right? To my absolute delight. So there was the knowledge dissemination component. There was a very kind of important material base in the technological side of the construction, right? There were homegrown construction systems, most famously MS Žeželj, which was locally patented and very unusually was not a large panel system, but a pre-stressed skeletal system that underlay a great deal of the most iconic, most famous of the products of the Belgrade School of Housing Architecture. So, what would be the product of this Belgrade School? Both Florian and Kimberli talked a lot about the wider urban organization and conceptualization of mass housing projects all over the world, right? Whether in the socialist world or in the capitalist world. And if we look at the urban concepts, if we look at formal expression, I would say that there is not a single defining feature of Belgrade School of Residential Architecture, because to kind of continue along the same lines as the previous speakers, there was a very, very obvious evolution, right, from the high modernist examples of the late 50s and early 60s to more brutalist manifestations in the late 60s, early 70s, to attempts to engage with an appeal to traditional forms of architecture and different forms of urbanity here in Block 19A, in New Belgrade with this raised platform and then this sort of hint of vernacular architecture from central Serbia, to the famed return to the traditional street, right? That started actually, was in many ways inspired by Split 3, but was beautifully implemented in a very different way in Cerak Vinogradi. So what I tried to say with just this very kind of breathless, quick view through these most famous, most iconic examples is that visually and urbanistically, we see a great variety of expressions, of motivations, of organizational systems, etc. So it would be very difficult to anchor what Belgrade School means in this sense. As a side note, I think the evolution is also very interesting in response to what Kimberli was saying in the case of Czechoslovakia, because it was the opposite. Rather than becoming larger and larger and taller, as was the case in Czechoslovakia, buildings became small, lower, and kind of deliberately more intimate, which was an interesting dimension, I think, that reflected this great deal of thinking about what it means to create a humane environment. However, there is one thing that connects all of these very different examples of mass housing architecture, and that is the apartment design. What ties together the entire Belgrade School of Residential Architecture is the so-called Belgrade apartment, which was its product. It's the ultimate product of this design ecosystem. It may be self-evident to local audiences, right to the point of being trivial, but it's not a trivial point at all, because the amount of design thinking that went into the experimentation and research with apartment plans in Belgrade was quite unique, I want to argue, on a global scale. Unlike other parts of Eastern Europe, apartments in Yugoslavia were never standardized, which produced a great variety of plans. But very interestingly, in capitalist countries, and I have now 20 years of experience of living in the United States, curiously, the market also gets to standardize apartment plans. So in my 20 years in the United States, I have lived in apartments that had very similar, almost identical layouts, whether it was in Texas or Florida or in New York or Washington, D.C. or here in Iowa. And in contrast, what the Belgrade School of Residential Architecture produced was something quite different, was a tremendous a variety of apartment plans that were very, very deliberately designed with very deliberate motivations that transcended those minimum dwelling requirements, right? From the 1950s until pretty much the collapse of Yugoslavia, the intensity of kind of exploring the combinatorics of how to organize an apartment plan, I would say, was one of the key motivations, one of the key tasks for architecture, especially in Belgrade. Whether they were students starting their education at the Faculty of Architecture, here we see some examples. Whether practitioners working on actual real life projects. Here we see the sketches by Alexander Stepanovic for Block 23. Here's an article from Professor Lojanica, where this combinatorics of plans in relationship to the skeletal system is explored. Again, variations of plans for the same project here as applied in practice. there was even a push to make apartment plans flexible, right? Which is very unusual. Again, I would say in global terms. By the 1970s, we see this intense exploration that research into the changing structure of families and the ways to accommodate families as they expand or contract, and that became one of the fields of research for architects, which signified a fundamental shift from those famed ideals, modernist ideals of standardization and typification, to something that we might call mass customization, right? And this is where we could perhaps even talk about the Yugoslav shift to its own form of post-modernity rather than kind of the modern ideals of high modernism. To the point that architects like Milena Marušić in particular were so dedicated to customizing these apartments that they even conducted post-occupation studies. We see this in the case of Cerak Vinogradi, where she worked directly with inhabitants to help them adjust and adapt their apartments to the varied needs of individual families. How did this design ecosystem define this Belgrade apartment? So the self-perception, right? This is what was theorized at the time, and that was constantly sort of explored and branded as an achievement, were two specific features that are common to a great deal of these various products of apartment designs. One is the so-called extended circulation, or as it was in Serbo-Croatian, proširena komunikacija, and the other one was roundabout circulation, or kružna veza. And here we see in the example of this really incredibly elegant apartment in Novi Sad, in Liman 3, we see first what this expanded circulation means, right? It's the central space at the core of the apartment, which is not exactly an enclosed box, an enclosed room, but is a sort of a circulation space that becomes sort of the symbolic heart of the apartment that's usually occupied by the dining table, right? We could, because of the symbolic dimension of the dining table for the feeling of domesticity, we could even argue that this is sort of the Belgrade school version of, I don't know, Frank Lloyd Wright's attention to the fireplace as the symbol of domesticity. The second key feature is the so-called roundabout circulation. I picked this apartment in particular because this roundabout circulation, right, is really in some ways pushed to its extreme in this plan, because it loops, right? The inhabitants are able to ambulate through the apartment unobstructed in many different ways, right? We see these three interlinked loops, so you can imagine children running through the apartment, right, unobstructed in pursuing many different paths. From the topological point of view, right, we could play mathematicians for a second and think about sort of the topology. There's a great deal of topological complexity to this plan, simply because of these open ambulating roundabout paths. In some ways, what this roundabout circulation led to was, again, to bring up Frank Lloyd Wright, is that kind of concept of the destruction of the box, right? That's something that Frank Lloyd Wright pioneered in the late 19th century. The idea that an interior space is no longer a clear box that has four walls, right? But is something a lot more ambiguous and allows for different circulation to occur in the apartment. But if we pay close attention to circulation, we will also notice something very, very unique. And that if you try to measure the space that's allowed to for the circulation, it is never much larger than what the minimum requirements allow, right? So all of these different paths are between 70 and 90 centimeters in width, right? This is sort of that functionalist minimum that allows one person to comfortably pass through, and which ultimately leads to relatively modest sizes of the apartments, right? This is where we start seeing the two sort of conflicting motivations becoming synthesized, which is this sense of openness, right, and space that acquires its symbolic dimensions and allows free movement, and yet still the need to stay within the constraints of social housing, right? Of the need to provide for the largest number. I would say this is sort of a manifestation of a very rigorous functionalism, right? Which took into account the placement of every single piece of furniture, and that allowed to the inhabitants, residents, to furnish their apartments very, very easily, because it becomes very obvious what furniture should go where. And yet, despite these very sort of functionalist limitations, the perception of the apartment is also kind of contradicts that. Note how the circulation lines are always aligned with windows, right? So whether we enter the apartment and have this long view towards the balcony, or whether we look in the opposite direction, perpendicular direction from the living room all the way across the apartment, there's always an opening at the other end, which kind of visually, psychologically opens the box in yet another way. And the sense of constraint is much less present than would normally be the case. So the box, that kind of a typical architectural box, again, is sort of deconstructed. And we see that over and over again, right? Here's an example from Cerak Vinogradi, where again we have this obsessive looping through the apartment, right? This constant ambulation through the apartment is present again. Also, rigorous minimal circulation, but also open views through the apartment. Same story here. Very different plan. Note how different this plan is from the ones that we've seen before, right? I think Kimberli is going to respond to this well, because she wrote about the standardization of apartment plans in Czechoslovakia. That is something that has been also written about in other contexts, right? For example, in the context of the Soviet Union. Our colleague Stephen Harris wrote about this and made this beautiful argument about how Soviet architects designed apartment plans in direct response to bureaucratic constraints of making sure that, for example, the apartment cannot be split between multiple families, right? This is a very different motivation from the motivations that we see here, right? Where psychological needs of the sense of openness, right, whether visually or physically through ambulation, are taken into account. I want to translate this sort of self-perception of the Belgrade apartment as roundabout circulation, extended circulation, into kind of more and wider sort of terms of modernist architecture, and to argue that what actually defines Belgrade apartment and what makes it largely unique in the global sense is the unlikely combination of two modernist tropes, right? Two sort of key features of modernist architecture, which is the open plan and rigorous functionalism, right? Both of these are embedded into the core principles of modernism. And yet, what we very, very easily often overlook is that these two do not quite blend together, right? Because if you try to create open plan, it's very difficult to enforce minimum dwelling standards And minimum dwelling apartments very often end up being just clusters of little individual boxes where the sense of open space does not quite work. Let's look at, for example, very famously, two projects by Mies van der Rohe, right? Almost exact same time, right? On the left is the Villa Tugendhat, one of the most celebrated examples of the open plan, where we see this living level, right, with the dining and living room and study and the garden, right, defined through these sort of free floating partitions, and you can ambulate freely through space, right? The sense of flowing space, right, is very, very clear. What we see on the right is the almost contemporaneous project for an apartment building in Weissenhof, right, where plans are on a much a more modest standard, even though these apartments are considerably bigger than what was possible to build in Belgrade at the time. And yet, the sense of openness and free ambulation that architecture defines is no longer possible, right? The rooms go back to being individual enclosed boxes, and this sense of space sort of dissolving into this free form configuration is no longer really present. Obviously, you know, both of these motivations were embedded in the thinking of architects, right? This is famous. This is the Bible, right, of every architecture student in Yugoslavia. This is how I started my education in the first year in college in the 1980s by studying the amount of space. That was literally the first exercise that we had, by studying the amount of space that you need to sit at the desk, right, or to pass through the apartment, or to lie in the bed. That is very different, for example, to how we start architecture education in the United States, right, which follows that more kind of Bauhaus model, where students start with abstract exercises in form and space, two and three dimensional compositions, etc. So this functionalist mindset was deeply embedded in the architectural thinking from the start of the architectural education. But architects also very clearly thought about spatial effects, right? These are two really beautiful drawings by Darko Marušić for apartments in the never built project for a block 30, right? It was eventually built according to kind of different, more modest standards. But we see this sense of openness, these sort of Wrightian diagonal views, right? Very, very clearly directed vistas, very consciously explored in these perspectives. And whether they were on kind of more luxurious scale, as was the original project of Block 30, or on a much more modest scale of the actual apartments that were built, these ideas were still very consistently applied in practice through the design of apartments. I want to say that this combination of open plan and real rigorous functionalism was perhaps not really a coincidence. First, it was obviously the result of the degree to which modernist culture was embedded among Belgrade architects. But also I want to draw attention to the construction system that underlay many, not all, but many of the examples that I showed, which is the IMS system, Žeželj, pre-stressed skeletal system, less globally common than the large panel systems, whether east or west. I want to argue that EMS Žeželj was a direct heir to Le Corbusier's Maison Domino, right? This sort of theoretical tool, the ideal that Le Corbusier posed in 1914, 1915, as trying to exploit the potentials of reinforced concrete skeletal structure for the creation of complex and flexible apartment plans. In many ways, this Maison Domino was the germ from which the idea of open plan developed right later on in the 1920s. The creator of the EMS Žeželj system was the ingenious engineer Branko Žeželj, whom we see on the screen, who designed the whole one of the Belgrade Fair that you see on the right, which was the largest dome in the world at the time, right? In Yugoslavia, just coming out of World War II and the war destruction, being able to produce the largest dome in the world, I mean, it must have been an incredible sign of a source of pride. And the person responsible for this was Žeželj himself. Žeželj was also the founder of the Institute for the Testing of Materials, right, EMS Institute, which, however, over time, also allowed for its subsidiary institution to emerge, the Center for Housing, which operated for a good decade and a half as one of the prime research institutions in which many of the actors that we saw in the captions to projects were related. The fact that Žeželj was not even an architect and yet played such an important role in this kind of emergence of the Belgrade School of Residential Architecture, I think is perhaps a good reason to go back to my original argument about the Belgrade School as a design ecosystem, which also raises the questions of the authorship. Who is responsible for the invention of the Belgrade apartment, and who is the creator of the Belgrade School of Residential Architecture? And I think we're getting here to a very interesting notion of potential collective authorship, which is something that in architecture theory and history has been raised recently. We have been talking about, historians and theorists have been moving away from that kind of traditional celebration of the a single unique architectural genius as the sole person responsible for the architectural design. We're starting increasingly to acknowledge the role of institutions, of collective offices. Kimberli has written about that in the context of the socialist world, but also colleagues in the West have been talking about and writing about the emergence of large corporate offices that produced the architectural designs. And what we see here in the case of Belgrade School is, in a way, a form of collective authorship, but a very interesting and very unusual form of collective authorship that offered a different path, right? Belgrade Apartment or Belgrade School was an entire design culture that came through collective agency, but it was heavily decentralized, and yet it still allowed individual figures to acquire prominence and to acquire names. So we still see these individual names, right? Whether Lojanica or Cagić or Marušić or Borovnica or Stjepanović and others, right? They are still the individually identifiable figures that clearly contributed to this. So to wrap my presentation, I want to argue that perhaps the biggest achievement of this Belgrade School was to balance out the need for collective action and collective provision of goods through collective action, and the need for individual identity and specificity. Whether we talk about identifiable names of architects or the apartments that could be adjusted and adapted to one's individual needs. And I'm way over time. I apologize for this, and I'm going to stop right here. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Vlada. This was really inspiring and comprehensive in a way, and it's very hard, being also a professional in this environment, to somehow restrict myself now for continuing, the discussion on these issues, which of course I'm not going to do this moment, otherwise this discussion can unwrap in all unforeseen directions, at the moment. So before we actually sum the whole thing up, I would like to sort of point out some themes that we raised during those three weeks and make some kind of common ground for the potential questions that are going to come from the other our general public. So what we are basically trying to do the whole time now, we are dealing and please, Tanya, just jump in whenever you think you need just to correct me. We are assessing, some positive and some negative things that we learned from the architecture of modernism during the socialist period throughout the world, basically. And at the same time, we are trying to find out the reasons why it is as it is, and we try out to somehow comparing all those architectures throughout the world. We are trying to find the reasons why this kind of architecture is more successful in one areas and less successful in other areas, but at the same time based on the same principles and the same construction techniques. And at the end, we have Vladimir Coolidge lecture, basically, who tries to explain the specificity of the Belgrade architectural scene of that time, which introduces some interesting elements that we cannot find at another architecture of the social period of time on the other parts of the world. So it's basically a setup on which we can raise so many questions and try to find so many answers. So before we start doing that, I'm asking, if anybody has anything to ask now at the moment.
Before we let our audience to post questions, I would like for three of our participants to comment on each other presentations. And I know that Kimberli and Vlada and I participated probably 10 years ago in one panel in which the question of Czechoslovakian architecture in relation to Yugoslavian architecture had been raised. And that's why I put that in my introduction to the exhibition catalog. That would be one question, one direction into our discussion can go. And I think Vladimir Lojanica also pointed out to the fact, as well as Vladimir Coolidge, that we all believe in specificities, in values, and superiority of Belgrade School of Architecture. And I think Vladimir Coolidge, to some extent, tried to explain why. But now after this presentation, I don't know if I would keep on teasing Kimberli to admit that we are better. It's not Europe song. We are not going to have the winner in the end. The other thing is we might not know enough, because we are raised in really this culture of enthusiasm towards housing architecture, believing it's good. So whenever we go abroad, either to the United States or to Czechoslovakia, we always say, wow, look at this crappy apartment. Didn't they have Professor Lojanica, the father of this person next to me, to teach them how to make a decent apartment? No, that's our reaction. Oh, when I start buying the apartment in the United States, I was saying, how am I going to buy this? They spend 1,000 square foot on nothing. I was angry because the way American architects, for example, deal with space. If you're not dealing with 3,000 square foot, you don't know where to start from. And that would be my comment on all comments. And I'll try to keep my mouth shut.
Florian, do you want to start with the comments now that you're settled in one spot? It's nice to see you.
Thank you very much. I see that you saw my entire travel through Scotland.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I found your points, Kimberli, extremely interesting. I mean, you started out the whole mass housing discussion with Karl Teige quoting Friedrich Engels, basically that the market can never provide acceptable housing for the entire population. That is a truth that is so far unrefuted. So. And as a matter of fact, I would rather say most of the world have a rather strong a stronger intervention into housing on the side of the state. This is, in a way, the US are somehow an exception there, or an important exception, including many other American countries. But what I would like to, and the other point that I got from you, Kimberli, which I found extremely important, is also that it's not really anymore about discussing whether we need multi-story housing or rather single-family housing. I mean, it is totally clear that the growth of the population at the world level cannot be accommodated in a single-family housing model, and in most countries is also not the case. I mean, the countries that experienced the biggest growth, like China, India, and so on, I mean, in single-family housing is just out of question, and no matter how rich you are, I mean, it's not even a question of class or of wealth. So at that level, I find it is quite important to discuss what are the differences. And if we now look at Belgrade, I mean, from us who are not so familiar with the Yugoslav context, obviously, Yugoslavia is often lumped together with the whole of Eastern Europe in that it is a country of high standardization, of, panel buildings, and this is sort of somewhat collectively dismissed. So Vlada's pointing out of the qualities of the Belgrade School of Architecture is somewhat a counterweight and an important counterweight for that. So my question to Vlada, or basically to all of you, would be if there is a tradition that went beyond the end of the socialist regime or beyond the end of Yugoslavia that continued. I mean, Kimberli had made the other point in Czechoslovakia. Say, well, a lot that made Czechoslovakia interesting and that made even the Panelaki interesting was a tradition that came from the pre-war period. Now we can say the same thing. Is there something that is now like a continuation of the Belgrade School tradition just whatever swept away and now people are doing something different? I would be interested in talking about that or hearing about that.
Do you want to start there, Vlada?
Vlada, yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm not perhaps the best person to answer that question because I haven't studied the answers very, very clearly. And I might be missing something that may have emerged in the more recent years. This very event is in a way a legacy of that, right? That there's this lingering understanding that this is something valuable that was produced at the time. But there was a time in the 2000s when housing construction sort of took off to some degree again. That made me curious to look into those buildings, and there were all kinds of problems that plagued the new construction, right? From not the most rigorous design, right? So when I found really appalling apartment plans, right, where you see columns in the middle of living rooms, etc., to the famous example of those poisonous toxic buildings, right, where some kind of a toxic paint was used and the building became completely uninhabitable. So my sense from a distance is that in practice, right, and it's now again, about the socio-political system more than architecture, that the kind of the commercialization of construction and the production of architecture in many ways dismissed this legacy, and that much of the knowledge was forgotten. There were, of course, there are pockets, right, of colleagues. I mean, including us here, right? This event testifies to that are absolutely aware of the importance of this legacy. But I think there's a disconnect with what's actually happening on the ground in the design, which is now completely commercialized and subjected to the logic of the market and fastest possible production for profit. So I will stop here because I think there are probably more competent people to respond to this here, including the moderators.
Okay, thank you, Vlada. If I may add something to that point, I will just start by saying that only last year there has been 700,000 square meters of erected residential architecture in Belgrade during 1 year. So it's a massive production, and I will just go on with the base that Vlada set in terms of some kind of the discontinuation of the positive tradition that we had at the Belgrade School of Architecture. And the idea is that from this period of socialism, where we have collectivity and collective awareness, and where we had then idealism and belief, and where we have a quality, now we have in a neoliberal state of sort of society in which we are today, we have the individuality, we have the sort of atheism, and we have a sort of profit versus the quality. So basically, when you have a look at those facts, I mean, you get the answer why the 700,000 square meters are not even close to what in quality to what they were, once in those periods that we were speaking about. But I just have to make some discourse from there, because not all of the architecture that was produced nowadays are bad. So this is not what I'm saying. I'm saying about the majority and about the average production. We still do have a very beautiful examples of the residential architecture, but the percentage is what's killing us at the moment.
So maybe I'll pick up on a couple things from the comments. I think for me, the Czechoslovak example, and Vladimir, you mentioned that I'd be interested to think about how the standardization figures into the conversation. And of course I am. And I think that there's one line in a book by Rostislav Švaka that I have been thinking about for many years. It's from the book's from 1995, but he mentions that one reason that they went to this, the standardization kind of hardened and increased, is that the panel factories became a very strong political lobby in Czechoslovakia, and they protected their interests in this conversation. So in other words, in the 50s, late 50s and 60s, I found maps of a whole series of panel factories that were built all across Czechoslovakia, and they made panels of a certain size, right? And with panelaks, those panels are the walls, the floors, everything that I mentioned. And those factories then became essentially an actor in your diagram that had a political power to stop a lot of experimentation with other systems. And you find imports of Danish systems and other kinds of one-off systems that were tried in individual examples in Czechoslovakia, but they were not picked up at the mass scale because there was this desire essentially to keep using the infrastructure they had built for the panels. And, I think your diagram, which we'll have a chance to talk about, I hope, soon together, since, because I love this kind of mapping and my new research includes this kind of mapping. So to think about in your diagram, a boundary line or a color code that has to do with actors who were fully within control of the state and actors that were not fully within control of the state, because we can do a similar diagram for Czechoslovakia, of course, and we'll talk about that because I'm very interested. I think what would happen is those names would tuck inside of some of your other shapes. So there'd be fewer free floating actors in the diagram. That's what Czechoslovakia looks like, but all the other players are there. And because those people get tucked into these other organizations like Stavoprojekt, which was the major design institute, the boundary line between state actor and independent actor changes. And that to me is the interesting question. Yugoslavia is the only country I know about enough to say this, that there was truly a kind of independent market for design services that did not exist at in an open kind of, I don't want to call it sanction, but in an open way that was part of the ecosystem. You know, in Czechoslovakia, there were architects doing private commissions, but it was all kind of under wraps and behind the scenes and not promoted as one of the pieces. And so the question of what's within the state's control, you know, and what's outside of the state's control, this is where I would place the Belgrade School in an interesting space, right? Because the fact that everything is within the state's control in Czechoslovakia, the building construction companies, the material producers, the design work services themselves were produced within these state design institutes. You cannot as an individual have any agency to say, I want to experiment with this other kind of system, right? Because all the inputs from the other parts of the ecosystem are directing you to limit your range of action. And so I think that the ability to use a stick system, just to be very kind of crude about it, you know, this is, in 1940s Czechoslovakia, this is the dream. You know, they want socialist architecture to be made with the Le Corbusier stick domino house system at, you know, prefab, but they want to have the free plan, free facade. You know, they want all of the things that the Belgrade School were able to bring into the mass production. It just became impossible because of the way that the entire economy was set up. And so, you know me, I always love talking economics, and I think that part of this is really interesting. And I have so much to say about the capitalist piece, but I don't want to say too much, so we can kind of keep going on it. But the profit motive of real estate right now everywhere changes all of the dynamics of the agency of the architect. This is what I would argue.
Absolutely, and if I may just follow up on that, I think your point about the economic framework is incredibly important, right? Because I think it ultimately underlies the outcome of the question of success or failure, right? To go back to what Florian was mentioning earlier, absolutely, right? The you know, who controls the purse controls the entire system, right? And the fact that in Yugoslavia, it was not really the state. It was never the central federal state that controlled the purse, even though there were powerful federal institutions like the army, but it was a much more complex mix, right? The state itself was greatly decentralized. There were also economic enterprises that were important investors with their own agency and their own motivations and agendas, right? I think that's what allowed this ecosystem to emerge. And just to make the comparison, right, to the United States, right, where we would never imagine, right, that the role of the state would actually be so prominent. But those examples that are typically touted as failures, right? Most famously Pruitt-Igoe, right? But there are others in Chicago that Florian wrote about, etc. There was actually federal central state funding as well as funding. It came from the state, right? Very ironically, unlike in Yugoslavia. And when the state withdrew the funding for that, right, for maintenance, for example, most famously Pruitt-Igoe, right? That's been widely written about. The project failed. And just to follow up on what Florian said, I completely agree with his sort of the picture that he paints. It's not about architecture, right? It is about the wider dynamics, social and economic dynamics that determines how architecture is inhabited. And in that sense, we're really, as architects, we need to get off of our high horse can reconcile with the fact that it's not us who ultimately determine the success or failure of architecture, because it is part of a much wider system, right? So that Le Corbusian idea that the architect is a prophet who can save the world does not apply. Nevertheless, when there are conditions, architects, as I think Belgrade School demonstrates, absolutely do have the agency to make a difference, right? Because other parts of Yugoslavia explored housing, but in different ways. It was not the apartment that was the center of the attention. And I think this is where the kind of that very, very fine, very subtle question of the power of the architect to make a difference becomes kind of very kind of clearly focused.
Thank you, Vlada. We'll take a couple of questions from the audience. One related to Kimberli, just said a couple of minutes ago, the discussion about the future of housing, and I think Florian also referred to the future of housing, and of course the future of housing within this context of a neoliberal economy. So the question is what is the future of housing, and how could we stop the investment in empty flats that is used only for rents? Do you see new paradigm of architecture, housing architecture?
Well, Kimberli, would you like to answer?
No, you start this one.
One. It's a very general question, and the part about the rent, I don't particularly understand. What is the future of housing? I mean, a few things are very clear. I mean, housing has to be multi-story at a world level because of climate emergency and so on. We won't go back from standardization, although the panel has run its course. We probably won't have new panel buildings, but some form of standardized buildings will continue, and architects will work with that. And in that respect, I always want to point out that as not that just the Eastern European architects were the masters of standardization. I mean, a lot of that you have in the Western countries as well. So this will stay as well. I would like to point to the fact that Kimberli mentioned before, the power of the panel factories in socialist countries. The two socialist countries I've researched, East Germany and Poland, had the same setup. It was also, they were big powers and actually continued their work against the criticism. By the 1980s, the critics were in the majority and panel had already run its course, but there was no return from this without basically having the whole system crumble, which we all know happened in 1989. Now, if you look at East Germany, that's a little different because then you had like West Germany investing and the state investing. But if you look at Poland, there was a continuation of multi-story building by successively more private housing associations, which were still not capitalist in an American sense, but obviously were included more and more market elements. It didn't spark a renaissance of architectural creativity, I have to say. It's not that this was the glorious period of like a new architectural renaissance in terms of multifamily housing. And I probably would say the same holds true to most Eastern European countries. So what went wrong?
So I'm going to pick up on the question of the rent that Florian was saying. You're not sure what it means. I think that what our audience is asking about is the speculative real estate market that's overproducing real estate, and then it's not intended to be for people to live in, but it's intended as a vehicle for tax. Like it's an investment vehicle. It happens to be an apartment, but you buy it the same way you buy a piece of art or something like that. You have no your investment is not in housing as a human right or housing as a community effort. It is simply a piece of property, and you make back your investment by renting it at a higher cost than what you pay on your mortgage each month. So in other words, it's a profit driven question. That's how I took that question. And I will say that this is something that preoccupies me personally as an American in this conversation, where, our system here in the United States has, I would say, sort of infected other parts of the world, because we've always had housing here that was driven by the real estate market, right? From the 18th century in the United States, there was never state investment in housing. And the only time was for about 10 years in the 1950s, which is when Vladimir was talking about that. I mean, to actually be the owners of the, to directly fund housing. Instead, in the United States, everything has been set up through government subsidized banks and through taxation and sort of giving real estate developers really good tax breaks, which increases their profits. So we could say that the whole question of housing in the United States, whether it's government subsidized or not, it's always been a profit motive related to housing. And it has not been a public good or a collective good model for housing. So this is what I think has unfortunately started to spread across the world, which is that real estate development is very lucrative. Vladimir and I had an interview that ended up with the title of "Our President is a Real Estate Developer" a couple of years, like in 2019, because Donald Trump's political power was driven out of all of the, what I would call a kind of criminal enterprise of real estate development in the United States through bankruptcies and all sorts of stuff. Like, we allow the real estate development industry to be a bad actor, and people see how much you can make in that sector of the economy. It's not a high risk sector of the economy, actually, because you have so many backstops through the banking system to not lose a lot of money. And so anyway, what I want to say about it is I feel personally that until the conversation can shift from housing as a form of an investment opportunity back to something where we understand housing as part of society and a public good, that the reason that we need more housing is not about who can make money from it, but in fact that we should want people to have a decent standard of living. We're so far away from that, at least in the United States. And it's very shocking when you really start to kind of deeply think about it. Personally, for me too, even though this is the only thing I've ever known. I've lived in Europe a little bit, but this is my home. I have been here almost, more than 45 years in the United States. And so I think, not a lot of people here are thinking about this. They don't understand that this is at the root of our homelessness problem and our housing problem.
We have a problem here, Kimberli. The problem is that we all agree on what you have just said, and I couldn't agree more. I don't think it's all the Americans' fault. I mean, in the United Kingdom, it wasn't because of Ronald Reagan. I mean, we had our own people who started the financialization of the housing market. But I do see in a lot of countries, including Germany and including particularly Scotland now where I live, that actually state investment into housing is appearing on the agendas of political parties. I don't know if you know, we have a Scottish election in 2 weeks, and it is actually a huge topic. So there is hope that this changes.
Good. This is good news.
If I may follow up on that, just put it what Kimberli said in good old Marxist terms, right? It's about housing as exchange value versus housing as use value, right? And just by being able to translate it in such kind of obvious Marxist terms, right? It points out that the question is fundamentally political, right? And that which is not to say that architects have no agency, because architects are always citizens as well, and can take political action, right? But the agency is not in the design, but in political engagement, right? In the struggle for the shift of perspective, a shift of motivation and orientation.
But to add to that, Vladimir, I think one thing that I try to teach our students here in Iowa is that when an architect adds value to a commercial project through good design, the benefit of that primarily goes to the investor through the sort of higher price of the in our current model, the value of design is in the price that the real estate can bring on the market, and that students need to be thinking about what are the ways to quantify or talk about the value that architecture has that is beyond the profit to the client. Because, like you said, we're all citizens. We want to be in a beautiful world, a comfortable world. We want to kind of improve the environment, and you can do that through design, but it usually gets written out of the budget if you can't prove to the client that they're going to make some money on it, right? And so part of the training for the students is to give them the vocabulary and the mindset to understand that they have to think beyond just making an economic argument and making more of a social argument, because right now everything is, at least in the Midwest, the market for design services is very focused on like brand and value added and profit and all of this stuff.
Yeah, that's precisely what I'm saying. There has to be an understanding that there's a kind of social responsibility, but that is now acting politically rather than narrowly architecturally, right? And,
yes.
And awareness absolutely needs to be cultivated.
Guys, I just need to stop you there at the moment. Thank you very much. We have a couple of more minutes and a couple of more questions from the public. So if you...
I just saw this question from Ivana, which I find interesting. And
Okay. But can we do first the first question coming from Professor Kadijević to Vladimir Coolidge directly? Vlada, can you see the question?
Yes, absolutely. So the question is, thank you very much for that question. Nice to see you today. Yes, absolutely. As I said, this sort of chart that I gave was not exhaustive in any way. And yes, I would say that the Museum of Applied Arts played a really, really important role. Especially by staging the exhibitions of competitions, right? And the architects were telling me. I remember Millennium Marush telling me how they always used to go to these competitions to see what the other participating architects did and learn from them, right? And to kind of see where the research of apartment design went. So absolutely, thank you for mentioning that. I literally just made this chart last night as a way to sort of clarify my thoughts, and it's far from exhaustive. It's a sketch, but absolutely, yeah. There's the cultural institutions should certainly be added to the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you, Florian. Do you think you can maybe continue?
Well, if I understand it correctly, it's basically what we can learn from in which sense is functional architecture still viable, or what aspects of functionalist architecture of this 1960s architecture are still okay? Well, the standardization and the inflexibility is certainly not among them. I think what we can learn from them is actually the advantages of planning, of certain planning, because you have an institute, basically an institution that sets the parameters of the city, which looks at the bigger context, which not just at one subdivision, and this is all inherent in functionalist planning. So if you want to plan for public transport, that is something that is doable. And certainly the values of density and of multi-story housing can also be learned from this, because this has to be the future. And I think the one thing that should be tackled is the inflexibility of these spaces, because the big point in which 19th century architecture has been superior to functionalist 1960s architecture is that it has stand the test of time, in the sense of being adaptable to different family types, to different work life balances, to different models of social cohabitation, and so on.
And I'd like to follow up on that. I think that's a very important point, and we are seeing sort of a newer interpretation now of this modernist functionalist architecture of the 50s, 60s, 70s, sort of becoming reinterpreted in modern terms currently. I think it's a very important year this year because the winners of the Pritzker Prize are Le Canton and Vassal, right? The French office that made its career by adapting and making more flexible precisely these standardized functionalist buildings by never going far beyond the aesthetic of the original building, but by simply adapting them to new standards and new spatial needs and the need for greater flexibility and spatial qualities and openness. So I think in that sense, that kind of a moment gives me a bit of hope, right? That there will be also kind of new creative push, an ethic among the architects to engage with this enormous housing stock that was inherited from the modernist period that does not necessarily need to be replaced at a tremendous environmental cost, but can actually be brought up to date to become livable and attractive again.
And, so I'm gonna try to take these last two questions together. Is that okay?
This is just what we wanted to
okay. So I'll try to answer together. I think that for me, one of the worst parts of contemporary design is the poor understanding of window placement and window size, and also of the sun. So I think that one thing that practicing architects could do is to have a better understanding of airflow, operable windows, views out of their apartment units, and in which direction. I've always been so impressed when Vladimir Coolidge talks about these apartments in which, as you look down the corridors, they always end in windows. And if you think about a contemporary apartment, this just never happens, especially in my experience in the United States. The developers punch a hole in the wall and stick a window, and that's it. And I think that's a really missed opportunity. The other thing that designers should be doing that I think would help is better storage. So one of the great things about socialist apartments and socialist living, in my understanding, is that people accumulated fewer things, and they also had ways to store those things, through either closets or these big stand-up like kind of piece of furniture that was a closet that the Czechs I know have everywhere. And I think a lot of developers in the United States don't think about storage as an architectural design element of the unit. And this is a great way to maximize space, because square feet is not always the way that you define a great apartment. You can have a big empty room that doesn't have a lot of windows, doesn't have a lot of storage, and that room doesn't function any better than if it would be half the size. And so for me, that like the questions of storage and of light, these are the big things that I think change an average apartment into a really good apartment.
So the Belgrade apartment, right?
Well, I've never seen one in person. I've only heard you talk about it. But, we're looking at everyone's books behind them, right? We need to store our things. And so there's a kind of, I guess I'm just saying, an attention to how the walls are used, where the openings are, where the light is coming in, how the furniture works. I think this is all something that contemporary designers could do better. And maybe the very last thing about that, in the socialist period, the range of options for furniture in particular were constrained, but they were also part of the thinking. Like the way you designed a unit, like Vladimir, when you were showing the Belgrade apartments, those tables and the different kinds of furniture, there was a sense of what those could be because they came from suppliers that were known, right? And you had a lot of furniture, or some furniture in the MoMA show, that really showed off the high quality of the furniture design. That's another problem these days, is furniture quality is so bad, and the best furniture is so expensive. And so you don't have a reliable source of kind of good, modest furniture that is convertible and good for storage and all that, except for IKEA. And IKEA, you know, has been kind of overexposed and also environmentally not a very good company, from what I understand, like the materials they use and the labor practices. So I don't know if anyone wants to pick up on that, but.
Okay, I'm afraid we have only just enough time for one last question coming for Vlada Kulić again from Alexandru Zahaira. Can you see the question, Vlada? And then
yes, I was afraid we'll run out of time, so I started typing the answer, but I can respond. Yes, there were attempts to engage with vernacular traditions, especially in the 80s. And I'm thinking also of so following up on Block 19A, right, and that idea of kind of the prefabricated structure resembling a wooden skeleton, right, and the placement of windows of traditional houses, etc. Yes, this became sort of an interesting mini trend in the 80s. I'm thinking of architects like Brane Mitrović, right, and Marušić as well. But I'm really not aware that this continued to today, except for maybe here and there in occasional projects. Even, hotels in Kopaonik, etc. Right, so there was kind of this wider interest in vernacular architecture.
You should talk about your book in this context, your postmodernism book.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, you know, I'm not sure how much it applies, but yes, the ideas, you know, of traditional architecture were combined in other contexts as well in large-scale mass housing. For example, in places like from the Soviet Union to Hungary to Central Asia, right, where the attempts to incorporate the ornament and colors that are associated with traditional culture absolutely made kind of made their way into mass housing panel prefabricated construction, right? So yes, both specifically in the Hungarian context, Virag Molnar in my edited book on socialist postmodernism does write about that extensively, right? About this sort of revival of nationalist vernacular tradition.
Thank you very much for this answer, and I would like now to say goodbye to everybody, unfortunately.
Can I make one quick last comment before we go?
Yeah,
I want to say that Vladimir and I are here together at Iowa State, and we would love to host students. If anyone wants to come as a master's student, as a Fulbright, any kind of research fellowship, we're here. And we're at the same place. And so we really hope that we'll start to see some interest for students to come over and hang out with us for a bit.
Yes, and we're even developing an online master's program. So we might even be able to do that at a lower cost and without the need to relocate to Midwest. So yeah.
But just write to us if you have questions about that.
Blatant advertisement, but yes, yeah. Please, yes.
We would like to invite everybody to come to Belgrade, see the examples of Belgrade School of Housing, because I say goodbye to everybody and thank you to everybody again.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you, Florian.
Thank you very much, Tanya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.